Okay, everyone. So this last video that we're going to be doing for class content is how to think a little bit more about prejudice and also how we engage in prejudice reduction. So first off, it's important to have some background terms when it comes to things like privilege. When someone talks about privilege, it can be sometimes easy to misunderstand them or to maybe even get a little defensive. So I think it's important for us to go through these terms and make sure that we understand what they are and what they aren't. So we can think of privilege as some sort of advantage that a person might have that could be power represented through economic advantage, representative advantage, or numerical advantage. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, when you look at how much money men and women make at the same job, women in the United States make about 73 cents on the dollar. And often things that are marketed towards women and then differently actually cost differently. It's called the pink tax. You can look it up. It's interesting. When it comes to representation, it's interesting to note that whereas men and women are about half the population each, women are a little bit more actually because we tend to live a little longer. That is not necessarily represented in our representative bodies. So half of our senators and half of our governors and half of our mayors and half of our House of Representatives and half of our Supreme Court justices are not women. So we don't necessarily have a high degree of representation, even though we do have numerical equity in terms of the number of people that we have compared to men. So 50-50, a little bit more maybe. And different groups differ in terms of their advantages that they provide, depending on what hats you wear. And we wear a lot of different hats. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about that. So once again, this privilege can be based in our history. When we talked about the root of a lot of stereotypes, we talked about how a lot of them come from very deep historical sorts of associations, how you can look at anti-Semitism stretching back to medieval era in terms of the sorts of associations we would have when we talked about Jewish people. And so a lot of times privilege as well is based in our history and rooted in our history and rooted in our traditions. And as a result, because it's cultural, it's often sometimes very hard for us to see, especially if we're on the receiving end of that privilege and benefit from it. So it tends to be deeply rooted in society in a way that we don't necessarily often recognize ourselves until it's pointed out to us. It's important to understand that there's all kinds of privilege, not just racial privilege, that people can have gender privilege, heterosexual privilege, religious privilege, able-bodied privilege, and so on and so on. And there's many different ways to slice the pie. And once again, a given individual might have higher amounts of privilege in certain environments and lower in others. They might have different hats that they can put on depending and take a look at their privilege through many different complicated lenses. When I say something like privilege, I mean thinking a little bit more about whether it is the same experience for you as it is for someone else, and whether the world was made for you or made for someone else. So, for example, I recently read a very heartwarming story the other day about how there is finally an elite point shoe company for ballerinas that is making brown point shoes. That for the longest time, ballerinas who were brown had to wear pink point shoes. And the whole point of point shoes is that they should extend your foot seamlessly, and they were made for people who were more pink in tone, for white ballerinas. And only recently have they started developing point shoes that are brown so that a brown ballerina can have that extension of her foot and have it be seamless the way that it's intended to be. The fact that point shoes for centuries were only made in one color for the elite ballerinas tend to be an example of privilege. When we have crayons and the flesh-colored one is the pink one, that's privilege. When different people would feel different levels of comfort walking down the street holding hands, that would be an example of privilege. When somebody can approach a building and go inside and someone else can't because there are stairs and they're in a wheelchair and there's no access available, that's a form of privilege. And once again, there are many different types of privilege and it can get very complicated. I tend to not think of it as a contest, but as a recognition of reality and the roots of where we are and where we came from and who the world tends to be more made for because of that. And to recognize it and to be aware of it when we see it, and to not necessarily have it be a source of shame, but to have it be a recognition that the world is not the same for everyone. And it's important to realize that some people have a harder path as a result of privilege that we might not otherwise recognize. I've linked you to a source called Unpacking the Invisible Backpack. It should hopefully be a useful exercise in walking through, thinking through your own privilege. Privilege can be very difficult to see, especially if you're the one that has it. It can be systematic. It can be seen as normal. Oh, this is the way things should be. This is the way things always have been. So therefore, this is right. It can be uncomfortable. And it's interesting to think about how it can cut a little bit against American values. American values state that we're all equal and that if you work hard, you'll succeed. But in reality, the deck can be stacked. When resumes are sent out that have a female name versus a male name to STEM jobs, and it's an equal resume in every other way, it's identical, the person with the man's name at the top gets more phone calls. And likewise, if the name is considered to be a white name versus a more ethnic sounding name. All this research has been published and is openly available if you're curious about it. But we don't have an equal playing field, despite the values that we claim to have as a country. And as a result of that, that can lead to some challenges, and that can be dissonant. We all know that we don't handle dissonance particularly well. So sometimes this can be a challenge for some people to work through and think about a little bit. But I really do want us to take the opportunity to think about it. On a side note, all of this conversation is so much easier in person because we can actually have conversation. I'm going to have the opportunity for you to discuss this a little in the discussion boards about what you think and feel, because I think it's really important for us to have these moments to connect with one another and communicate with one another rather than just have me tell you about things. So hopefully we will be able to make constructive use of the discussion forums and really come to a greater conversation about this, because that's how we learn and grow, especially when it comes to some of these more challenging things. Here's a classic example of privilege. Why don't we have White History Month? The answer to that is that for most of our history, we tend to hold up white people and talk about them and reflect on them and celebrate them. And so the answer is we do 11 other months out of the year. That would be an example of a classic privileged statement that sometimes people make. All right, we're going to talk a little bit more about prejudice, how we measure prejudice, and how we reduce it. So when it comes to prejudice, you can think of prejudice as negative feelings towards a person based on their group membership. And we tend to break that into implicit and explicit prejudice. So implicit prejudice tends to be our automatic associations. That's based on how accessible that information is, which is usually determined by how frequently we've encountered it. So you can get a lot of information that you kind of soak up in the atmosphere as you grow up about how people tend to be thought about. And you can get exposed to a lot of information, once again, through just all sorts of sources, through the media that we consume, through the friends that we have. And the more exposure we have to some information, the more accessible that information is. So implicit prejudice can be our initial impulse that we can then correct with thought, which requires, as you know, ability and motivation. Explicit prejudice tends to be deliberate, conscious, intentional. Sometimes it can be moderated by social desirability concerns. So for example, sometimes it might be less appropriate to openly admit prejudice towards a certain group. And for other groups, it might be fine to openly admit disgust or fear toward that particular group, depending on the environment or the current conditions. You can think of it as a two-stage process, similarly to many two-stage processes that we've learned about in class so far, where you have an initial implicit reaction that is then corrected to an explicit one if needed. So for example, you might have a conscious response to something after you've made that initial unconscious, fairly automatic, quick association that is a course correction. or you might double down and lean in and have that become more explicit. Modern racism is interesting because it's less socially desirable to openly express. And once again, it can sometimes spring from this sense of disconnect or dissonance, where we have a stated belief in the importance and value of equality as a country, along with the notion that we should work hard to get what we deserve. So when someone notices structural inequality that cuts against those particular values, then sometimes it can get interpreted as, well, this person doesn't work very hard, or if they only worked harder, then they'd be successful, without recognizing those bigger structures that could be at work. And it's interesting how sometimes the values that we have, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, and we all have the same chance, can sometimes really fly in the face of reality, which is that, once again, we don't all have the same deck that we're playing from. And so we don't necessarily all have the same opportunities available to us. And sometimes the hardest work in the world won't get you ahead. I'll tell you what, folks who work 4 jobs to get by, they're the hardest working people I know. And they aren't getting ahead no matter how hard they try. So that's something to think about. Colorblind racism is a particularly interesting form of modern racism that stems from a place of well-meaning, but can sometimes lead to some negative outcomes. So colorblind racism is the basic concept of I don't see color, or racism isn't a problem these days, and people who point it out are problematic and just causing trouble. We've moved beyond that now. We're no longer a racist society. And when people say, I treat everyone the same and I don't see race, that can be, once again, from a place of very well-meaning. But it sometimes flies in the face of reality when it comes to people's lived experiences. So it's seen as a form of racism, benevolent racism, but racism nonetheless. And so it's interesting to think about how sometimes someone can have very good intentions, but when they say, I don't see race, but in reality, race really does play an important part in all sorts of things. When it comes to how nervous someone is when they're being pulled over by the police, or whether they get that phone call for that job, then that can serve as another form of blindness in terms of the problems that racism has within our society. Modern racism is much more likely to be expressed by discomfort instead of by overt behavior, once again, depending on the circumstances. So, for example, when people study modern racism, they're more likely to study how implicit prejudice can lead to less eye contact and greater distance between chairs when you're asked to place a chair next to someone who's of a different race, so that people who have a higher score on implicit prejudice will often display these interpersonal social cues to indicate that they're uncomfortable. Also, in conversation, they tend to have shorter conversations with someone of a different race if they have scores who are higher in implicit prejudice. Sometimes when we're talking about things like ability and motivation, that can lead to some interesting differences. So someone who might score high in implicit prejudice, once again, that automatic association, but who has an internal desire to be low in prejudice, might express guilt or overcompensate in ambiguous situations to work extra hard to give someone the benefit of the doubt, or to overly praise or be effusive in trying to be friendly when situations are ambiguous, to try to compensate for that feeling of guilt. Whereas someone who has a high degree of implicit prejudice and doesn't desire to change, but feels pressure from external sources to tamp down their associations, might feel a sense of resentment at being muzzled or being unable to speak their mind. And they might overcompensate by being overly negative in ambiguous situations where they can attribute their decisions to something other than race. So, for example, they might say, oh, well, there's all these reasons why I didn't give this person a phone call. Look at this and that and the other thing. But if someone who was white, who had the same sort of resume, had the same sort of issues, then they wouldn't necessarily express those differences. And we've studied this in terms of how people might respond to, for example, a resume, depending on how they rate on these factors. Once again, the key is that they can attribute their prejudiced behavior, their bias, to other reasons, and therefore feel justified in their decision. I'm going to go ahead and give you a link to allow you to take the IAT to explore this a little bit more. This is the way that we measure our implicit attitudes and associations. Basically, it was a test that was developed to explore those automatic associations that we make. And it's always intriguing to explore this a little bit more. It's important to think about this once again as kind of that immediate connection that we make based on the information that we've consumed, regardless of what we might believe about it in our explicitly stated beliefs. It can sometimes be very constructive about the sort of information we've taken in over the years and how it can lead to certain associations automatically without our necessarily thinking about it a great deal. Basically, it studies reaction times. So the classic IAT will show a picture of white faces and pictures of black faces and ask you to associate that with different emotions. So in one condition, it might ask you to associate white with good and black with bad. And in the other association, it might ask you to associate white with bad and black with good. And if one of the associations is harder for you or takes a longer time, that means that you have less of a direct connection to it in your brain. It's less accessible to you. That it takes a little longer for you to make that connection because it's less available, which indicates a higher, quicker association between certain things than others. This is considered to be a test that doesn't necessarily allow for social desirability concerns. So you're not given time to adjust or to moderate your decision based on what you'd prefer the test to show. And so it kind of reduces social desirability. It reduces your ability to make that adjustment, so it's able to measure that first stage, that immediate association that you make before you filter. It's important to know that implicit and explicit attitudes have a fairly low correlation. So someone who might indicate they have a high degree of implicit prejudice on the IAT might not necessarily say that they have that prejudice in their explicit attitudes. It might be interesting to take a look at nonverbal behavior to see if that follows through. But explicitly stated attitudes and implicitly measured attitudes don't tend to relate as strongly as you'd think that they would, especially as it becomes less socially appropriate to publicly express that prejudice. So, for example, it's actually fairly socially appropriate for us to be prejudiced against people who are overweight these days. There's a lot of public shame that can go into it, and it can get really disheartening, but it's one of those things where it's fairly normative to call out someone who's overweight and to publicly shame them. And it's more socially appropriate to publicly express that than it is to publicly express racism. And research has shown, for example, that the correlation between implicit and explicit attitudes for people who are overweight are much more highly correlated than implicit and explicit attitudes for race. And it's also important to know that attitudes don't predict behavior. You know, once again, as much as you'd think that they do, you might hold an attitude about something that does not necessarily automatically mean you will behave in a certain way. And attitudes tend to predict behavior under very specific circumstances. So we've talked about the connection between attitude and behavior and about how we tend to have attitudes predict behavior when it's very specific and when it's a very strongly held belief. And other factors that do that as well. So once again, implicit attitudes really measure something that's a little bit more complicated than how you personally might think and feel about something. It's a little bit more about how much exposure you've had to a certain particular association that is kind of laminated and built up different layers, and every layer that's built up strengthens that association. So it's interesting to think about where that might have come from. One of the ways of thinking about the IAT is that people are processing information at a categorical level rather than an interpersonal level. And people might confound relevant and irrelevant material. I've been talking a lot today. So, for example, there was a study that showed positive black faces and negative white faces, and people's IAT scores were the same as when the faces were just strangers, indicating that we weren't thinking, oh, that's MLK, I'm going to associate him with good, that it was just a very quick, automatic, broad, categorical association that we were making. And once again, you think of it as our traditional and historical associations and our media exposure. and that it's something different. It's something different than your internal beliefs and values. So use that to help contextualize a little when it comes to your results, when you explore this a little bit more yourself. On a side note, I'm going to try to keep videos between 15 and 20 minutes. We just have a little bit more information here, so I'm just going to work my way through it and have this go a little long. So once again, if we're exposed to a lot of negative information, it tends to be a lot more accessible. It's interesting to think about how that could build up over the years and where that might come from. Okay, let's talk about prejudice reduction, which is the last thing we have to do, and it doesn't take long. All right, so one of the key things is education. The more you learn about how stereotypes work and how prejudice works, the better you're able to adjust your beliefs and think a little bit more about where those things might come from. And once we label things and understand them better, it's easier for us to wrap our brains around. Education works to reduce prejudice. One of the most basic things to reduce prejudice is called recategorization, which is where you categorize someone from an out-group to an in-group. That might involve recognition of the fact that you might like the same kind of music. So it's like, oh, we both like this music? Okay, we're a part of this particular music group. We're both in this together. Cue High School Musical chiming into your ears. But anyways, when you recategorize someone and they become part of your in-group, you treat them differently. You think about them differently. You process information about them differently. And categorizing someone as a member of your in-group is a really great way to reduce prejudice. You can think of prejudice as a bad habit, as something that has been learned and that can be unlearned through classical conditioning training. So you can do cognitive training in order to train your brain to make different associations or a wider variety of associations that can dilute the quick connection that you make that is automatic and negative. You can learn to discount the automatic associations that you make, which is often a tool used in behavioral cognitive therapy. And once again, you can develop alternative associations. The more associations you come up with, the less likely you'll leap immediately to the negative one. If you have a variety of associations, then that will dilute the negative associations that you have. So the more connections you have that contain variety of information, the less likely you have a highway to that negative association, and the more you have a series of country roads that contain a wide variety of information. That's one way of thinking about it. Also, when you have alternative associations, it promotes an incremental theorist perspective as opposed to an entity theorist perspective. So you're more likely to see the associations that you make as malleable. The most famous way to reduce prejudice is contact hypothesis. So this was developed as a particular study called the Robbers Cave study done by Sharif, I believe. There should be a copy of it, I think, in your readings text. But the contact hypothesis was developed to explore how to reduce intergroup conflict between two groups that really don't care for one another at all, and has been used in a series of camps for children from different conflict zones for decades in order to help increase community and to connect people across lines of deep, profound difference. So the key is exposure, of course, and interaction with the outgroup, but under very careful circumstances in order to promote the best possible outcomes. And here's a few things. So first of all, the two groups must be on equal footing. And usually when you have groups that have deep conflict, there can sometimes be some profound differences in status when it comes to economic power or number. And so trying to put people on equal footing within the space that you're encouraging contact is important so that one group doesn't have an advantage over the other. It's very important that the groups interact cooperatively rather than competitively. You don't want to set up a soccer match between the Israeli and Palestinian kids. That's not going to go well. You want them to work together on something where they're building something together as a cooperative enterprise as opposed to competing against one another. It has to be a positive outcome that they all want to achieve. And once again, people have to see one another as possessing similar competencies and as all being able to contribute to the outcome in a positive way. Ideally, you want people to come together under a variety of situations where they cooperate and where they communicate with one another and work together so that it can generalize more easily to the external environment once they leave. And you want to establish how similar you are to one another in terms of beliefs, values, and goals, or even something as silly as we have the same birthday, or we like the same movie, or we have the same favorite color. The more you make those connections, the more likely you are to break down barriers that can be very strongly held negative beliefs. And once again, the whole goal is to generalize so that someone doesn't just have a very meaningful connection with someone who's different to them in the immediacy of this camp, but that they can connect it to the outside world and follow through with it and hold it when they leave. So the Robbers Cave study is the classic example of this. Once again, I think you have access to it in a reader, and has led to youth camps in Ireland and the Middle East to explore this a little bit further among groups that have had deep-seated, long-standing conflict to try to heal some of those generational wounds.